Yeah, thanks, Connor. Good to be here. So just to tell you a little bit about myself. So as Connor said, I head up New Relic Commercial for EMEA, which is, and our EMEA headquarters is in Dublin. But that's where the simplicity ends, and it starts to get pretty complex after that, as many of you will know, because we have a lot of functions in Dublin. We're also a growth organisation that's changing pretty rapidly. So to just give you some of the backstory for that, and then I'll get into some of the nuances about how some of our decisions are made within the company, how things have changed, some things that I've learned, and some tips that might be of use to you. So New Relic, we are a pure play SaaS company. We're 9 years old. We're publicly listed as of 2014. So we have all that kind of quarterly pressure that comes with that you'll be familiar with. We are in Dublin about 3.5 years, and I am with New Relic for just over 1.5 years. So we started out, from scratch, obviously, but within the first 3 months there were about 6 people within the office, mainly focused on sales. That's obviously grown significantly, but we've also added a lot of functions here in Dublin, both the back office G&A type functions, and then also a tech support piece, while still scaling out the sales element. And that sales element, again, as you know, is multifaceted with sales teams looking after different line sizes, SDR, business development type folks, digital marketing, and so on and so forth. So as it stands today, we are at about 100 people here in Dublin. We've, again, a story lots of people will be familiar with. We've grown out of our office twice already, and we've been moving to our third one, hopefully in April of next year. And that, again, I'll touch on, but that was quite another saga, and very central to the whole decision-making process for the company in general, and for the investments in Dublin in particular. So, with that in mind, just to think about this a little bit. So, New Relic decided to move to Dublin about 4 years ago, when the company was just over 5 years old. I would say that, given what's going on in the technology market space, and I am primarily talking about technology here, the technology space has really become more disrupted and more accelerated than before. And I would say that where New Relic starting out now, I'd say that we'd be internationalizing within 2 or 3 years. So I think those decisions around where to make investments are happening earlier and earlier. And then how you go about rolling out those investments is pretty central. So coming to Dublin then, I think a lot of the original decision for Dublin, I think, just to echo some of what Shane was talking about, was made by the board, which consisted of some people who had actually made investments in Dublin before, and I think that was pretty much the primary driver. Now, as it happens, interestingly, as you said, some of those people have left. So now it's a case of just staying in touch with the decision process and making sure that we're continuing to build on that. And the primary reason for the investment was the talent, again, no surprise, and not for some of the other factors around tax or whatnot, because as we know, unfortunately, the majority of the software industry, and especially the SaaS industry, is loss-making still, so tax isn't so much of an issue, but the availability of talent is very much what we're about here. And so it's really important that we're able to demonstrate that to the folks at C-level in the HQ. So again, just speaking of my specific case, we actually have about 4 hubs in Europe, and there's some of them are from legacy. Well, one of them is kind of a legacy decision based on an acquisition of an engineering firm in Barcelona, and then suddenly Barcelona became the default engineering hub. So that's something that we have a little bit of tension between Dublin and Barcelona around. And then the other side of this was that all of the sales for EMEA was initially done out of Dublin with some support from our San Francisco HQ. But as we have grown up in terms of the size of our customers, particularly the enterprise type business, and needing to get closer to customers, we have started to put centers in other countries. So Berlin, Zurich, and London are currently locations where we have people on the ground working with customers. So again, that creates a kind of an element of some of that tension for investment decisions. Now, we are still a small company, so it's relatively easy to navigate that. And again, I'll touch on some of that. But one thing I would say is that, you know, and a learning for me was initially, you know, I was all about the number of sales heads and, you know, and growing that out as the main driver for the company. But I've started to realize that it's really important that we also maintain what we call the G&A functions within Dublin, and that's a big centre of power, if you like, for the company. If we're driving finance and deal desk and digital marketing, legal, people ops, etc., out of Dublin, then that really creates a centre of power and really supports decision making that favours, frankly, my team and the team in Dublin. So that's all well and good. There's a flip side to it, though, which is that, as I kind of alluded to earlier, while all the sales guys report to me, we also, as a growth company, we have a lot of other reporting lines, and this is something that's really challenging for us as a company. I think, you know, if you work for a more established company, you might have already got to a point where you're, you know, essentially hubbed through an umbrella organisation in EMEA. We're not there yet, and so from a decision-making point of view and working with the stakeholders in the US, that is pretty challenging, because while the sales folks might account for more than half the headcount, we still have, I won't tell you how many, I'd be embarrassed to say, but we definitely have north of 10 separate reporting lines for all those different functions going into the US, and that makes decision making challenging. It makes, you know, culture challenging. It makes, you know, budgeting challenging to coordinate all that. So again, a learning for me, that's something that I'm actually working on now, candidly, is to try to see, can we at least cluster those teams locally to some extent? And I'm sure others of you have done this more successfully than I have, but can we, you know, just at least cluster around, say, people ops and cluster around finance, so we get some level of coherence there, and also help us in Dublin to project a more coherent message about what's going on and what we're looking to do. The other key thing is property, and I'm sure we're all, every Irish person is a property expert of some shape or form, but property is a key thing for the decision making, and a key issue to engage, I think, the stakeholders on. And I mentioned that we've you know, it's public domain knowledge, we've signed a lease. We'll move in a few months' time to a shiny newer building. But the raw capacity of that building is really important for us in terms of, we'll now have, you know, close to triple capacity, and so we need to then make investment decisions appropriate to that. So to Conor's point about engineering hubs, while I'm not, or at least no longer an engineer, you know, we do get a chance to influence some of that and look to see if we can steer some of that investment to Dublin, which, you know, also strengthens our ability to go to market based out of here. So those property decisions are essential, and one thing that I think I did get right earlier on is get close to the CFO and close to what we call the real estate workforce people, to help influence that decision and make sure we got it locked into Dublin and got it right. And that's a really long-term decision. In fact, that's one quirk of the property market, is that, you know, leases tend to be in, David Butler's nodding, I know he's felt this pain. Leases tend to be, you know, of, you know, 20-year sort of variety, maybe with a break clause if you're lucky. Whereas, you know, business planning, certainly in the tech world, certainly in the SaaS world, doesn't really go beyond 3 to 5 years, because it's just changing so rapidly. So trying to match the company's business plan with some, you know, super long-term property investments is tricky, and you really need to stay close to the decision makers on that score. But once you do that, I think you get a payback, because you've got a platform to work off in terms of leveraging future investments into Dublin. I've talked a little bit about this. What I was going to touch on here was the piece about the multi-stakeholders, but I just think it's to reiterate the importance of getting the G&A folks on board as well. I talked about clustering those a little bit and trying to, you know, get access not to your own line managers. In my case, it's the revenue side, the chief revenue officer, but the CFO and the people ops folks as well are going to be very important for you. So I do think it's important to really get close to those guys and kind of get inside their heads, understand their background, understand the culture they came from, understand, you know, some of the previous decisions that they or their companies made. So, I mean, to give you an example, I can share it now because she's left. But when I joined, my boss had also worked in Oracle, where I had worked, and also in Salesforce. And I'm kind of not ashamed to say I spent a lot of time researching her and figuring out what she did while she was here, or when she had investments here, what kind of language she used, how she thought about stuff. I was even stalking her a little bit by looking at videos of talks she did at conferences and so on, just to get inside her head a little bit in terms of how she thinks, what her priorities are. And I felt then that, as Geraldine was saying, you get surprisingly little face time with these people. Even if you report to them, you still sometimes get surprisingly little face time with them to really influence them at key moments. And I think if you're able to play that back in their own language, literally using words like friction or whatever the buzzword du jour is, if you're able to couch it in terms of how they made previous decisions, then I think you're going to much higher likelihood of success with that individual. So I think it really is worth doing some research on those folks to up the ante in terms of influencing. Problem with only having pictures is hard to know where you are with the slides. But the other thing is then, you got to be at the table regularly, and that means particularly in US-based companies, you're going to have to just deal with the time zone factor. For a lot of us, I guess, San Francisco is a home. Some people might be luckier to have New York, but if San Francisco is your home, that's -8 hours, and you're going to just have to suck it up and be on video calls with San Francisco. One thing that I, again, maybe perhaps accidentally did well at the start was to try to get them to set aside 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. as Dublin time, where they would, meetings that have an impact on international and Dublin in particular would happen around that time, so that I could participate. And that's kind of become a little bit of a mantra within the company. And I've young kids, so I really need to be getting home before 7 o'clock to get them to bed. So that's been just a small thing that's made it sustainable for me, because if you are in a company where the culture is different, and I have friends who are in the position where they're on conference calls all night and so on, it's really hard to sustain that over a few years of staying really engaged, and you find you opt out of a lot of stuff and you get disengaged. I was at SaaS Talk a few weeks ago there, and I was talking to he's actually a customer of ours, but another SaaS company their HQ is in Tallinn in Estonia, which is another +2 hours on us, and they had set up their US office in San Francisco, and this guy was a founder, the chief product guy, and he said they just simply couldn't do it, because the back and forth of the day lapse. It's like it's like one of those sci-fi films where you're going on a interstellar journey. Like just the lag in terms of ask a question, get a response, just made stuff intolerable. They got quite burned out from it. They actually moved. They shut their San Francisco office, which is pretty unusual for a SaaS company, and they moved it to New York. So he still has a 7-hour difference, but it's better than it was. But it is indicative of that time zone thing is a big factor. It comes at a cost to you personally, but I think you really got to lean into it. And if you can, train the US guys to work on your terms on your hours. That's supposed to be phone a friend. That's what I asked for that image, so that's what I got. You can't be there all the time. And one other thing that I learned and I found useful in terms of trying to influence the folks in the HQ was to just develop a couple of relationships outside of my reporting line. Somebody who's typically involved in all of the key meetings, and who can kind of give you a steer as to what's actually going on. Because I think all of us have probably had situations where we're blindsided by initiatives that come out of corporate. I talked to a couple of people already this morning about this. And then you're scrambling to A, appear like you're still in control, and B, to adapt it to your circumstance in EMEA or whatever. So if you can have an insider, and in my case, I have a weekly call with the director of strategy in San Francisco, which is totally overkill for the amount of actual work we have to do together. But it's really useful for me to get a kind of a temperature check on what's going on in HQ. And most of the times the meetings are pretty bland and you're tempted to cancel them, but then every now and again stuff flares up, and it could be something that a new board priority or whatever that will then be coming your way. And if you can get ahead of it even by a week, that's really useful. So I really value that relationship with that guy and make sure to cultivate it every time that I'm in the HQ. The other thing with the relationships is to get the to obviously encourage the top guys to come to Dublin, and but to what I found again a learning for me was to try to control it a little bit and have it structured if possible, and what I've tried to do, at least in my mind, this is how it works, is that the CXOs types, of which there are 6 in my organisation, try to get them to come here, on a rotating kind of quarterly schedule, because what was happening was that they would, arrive in, very little or no notice, massive disruption, everybody gets pulled around, it's a distraction for people doing their jobs, but it's also very difficult for you to kind of, set the tone and steer the culture a little bit in the office when you're getting completely getting bombed occasionally by these guys coming in. So I've tried to structure that. Now, obviously, I don't control these people, but I've tried to encourage them to come in a more structured fashion once a quarter, and they have an informal rota that they now work through. So last quarter we had the CFO over, and he was looking at the building, and it was an opportunity for me to influence that cluster of that whole finance group, the deal desk, the budgeting, and so on. This quarter, the chief people ops lady is here, and it's again a bit more around the people side, the recruiting and planning and headcount budgeting and so forth, and just to try to keep that kind of cadence going, so that you're in touch with all the guys, but it's not become a distraction and a sideshow. And you can, if you're really organised, you can sync it in with town halls and so on a regular cadence. And again, not to overdo this town hall stuff, which I think some companies are guilty of doing, but to get roughly once a quarter kind of cadence, to get the messaging from HQ. But then it's an opportunity for me to influence these folks as well. Conor again touched on, or actually Shane touched on about or both of you actually, the groups within the other groups within EMEA, and so my this used to be my own internal monologue, but it's kind of become kind of a bit of a joke in the company now, is that I take the Godfather approach to this, which is that friends close and enemies closer. So I stay very close to the guys who head up the other sites in Zurich and London, which are actually smaller sites, and Barcelona, but they do wield quite a bit of power, and it's really important to know what messaging they're giving back to the US, so that we have at least find some level of common ground, so that we can appear relatively joined up and coherent. And then if I have want to go on a solo run, I have a fair idea of what the terrain looks like, and what the objections are, and what the potential competition might be. And so that's a constant dynamic, a kind of a frenemy dynamic that I have with the guys who head up Zurich and Barcelona in particular. And to be honest, we're kind of open about it, which is it's not quite a Machiavellian backstabbing thing, but it's probably not far off it either. So friends close, enemies closer. And then if I had one final tip for people in this area, is that the US guys, in order for you to be credible and to influence their decisions, they will want to have a pan EMEA type view at least, or maybe a pan international view. So I would say that if you don't have one, to set up a EMEA leadership team, or if there is one already, to make sure you have a strong voice and a seat at that table, because that's again a very good way to know what's going on, to influence others, and maybe even to carve out a bit of space for yourself to say, look, I'm really driving to do the whole business development SDR function out of Dublin, and you can maybe clear a path for yourself that way, and you can eliminate a lot of objections and obstacles. So that's been my journey so far in New Relic.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much.